In the deep, jagged wilderness of the San Pedro Mountains in Wyoming, where the wind screams through the granite canyons and the shadows seem to hold their breath, two men once blasted through a wall of rock and stumbled into a nightmare that would rewrite American history, or haunt it forever. They weren't looking for a miracle, they were looking for gold. What they found instead was a tiny, bronze-skinned figure sitting cross-legged on a ledge, staring at them through the dust of centuries with half-closed eyes and a mouth full of sharp, fully formed teeth. This is the true story of the San Pedro Mummy, a discovery so baffling that it challenged the Smithsonian, fueled legends of a lost race of tiny people, and then vanished into thin air, leaving behind only grainy X-rays and a mystery that refuses to die. Part 1. The Blast in the Dark. The year was 1932. America was gripped by the Great Depression, and in the high country of Carbon County, Wyoming, desperation smelled like blasting powder. Two prospectors, Cecil Maine and Frank Carr, were working a vein of gold in the San Pedro Mountains. They reached a dead end, a solid wall of rock that seemed to guard the heart of the mountain. Frustrated and determined, they set a heavy charge of dynamite. The explosion was deafening, shaking the very foundation of the ridge. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, they didn't find a vein of gold. They found a cave. It was a small, natural grotto sealed away from the world for perhaps 1,000 years. As their lanterns pierced the darkness, they saw something that made the hair on their necks stand up. There, on a small stone shelf, sat a tiny man. He was barely 6.5 inches tall in his seated position, about 14 inches if standing. His skin was dark, wrinkled, and leathery. His arms were folded across his chest, and his legs were crossed in a meditative pose. He had a flat skull, a heavy brow, and his features were perfectly preserved, right down to the tiny fingernails. The prospectors didn't see a doll. They didn't see a statue. They saw a mummy. They named him Pedro. Part 2. The Tiny Man of Casper. Maine and Carr brought the mummy down to the town of Casper, Wyoming. Word spread like wildfire. In an era before the internet, Pedro became the ultimate roadside attraction. People flocked to see the miniature man. The first thing that struck everyone was how human he looked. He wasn't a shriveled fetus or a deformed animal. He looked like an old man who'd been shrunk by some impossible magic. His weight was a mere 12 ounces. But the mystery took a dark turn when the scientists arrived. In 1950, a local car dealer who had acquired the mummy allowed it to be examined by Dr. Henry Shapiro, an anthropologist from the American Museum of Natural History. The world expected Shapiro to laugh and call it a hoax, a gaff made of paper mache and monkey skin like the infamous Fiji mermaids of P.T. Barnum. Instead, the X-rays revealed something terrifying. The X-rays showed a complete human skeletal structure. Pedro had a spine, a rib cage, and 4 limbs. Most shockingly, the X-rays revealed that the baby-sized mummy had a full set of teeth, including wisdom teeth and heavy wear on the molars, suggesting he was a fully grown adult, perhaps 65 years old at the time of his death. His skull appeared to have been crushed by a blunt object, and there was blood congealed at the top of his head. The scientific world was paralyzed. If this was a human, it was a human that shouldn't exist. Part 3. The Legend of the Nimirigar. While the scientists scrabbled for explanations, the local Shoshone and Crow tribes had a much older story to tell. For generations, the indigenous people of the Wind River Range had spoken of the Nimirigar. These were a race of tiny people who lived in the mountains. According to legend, the Nimirigar were fiercely protective of their territory and would attack larger humans with tiny bows and poisoned arrows. The most chilling part of the legend, however, concerned how they treated their own. The Shoshone claimed that when a Nimirigar became too old or too sick to contribute to the tribe, his own people would strike him on the head with a stone to kill him, then mummify the body and place it in a sacred cave. Pedro had a crushed skull. He was found in a sacred cave. He was found in the heart of Nimirigar territory. To the locals, Pedro wasn't a mystery. He was proof that their legends were real history. Part 4. The Science of the Little People. As the decades passed, modern science tried to reclaim the story from the world of the supernatural. In the 1990s, the University of Wyoming conducted a new round of tests on the data available from Pedro. The mummy itself by then was missing. More on that shortly. The researchers, led by Dr. George Gill, proposed a biological explanation, anencephaly. This is a rare birth defect where a child is born without parts of the brain and skull. They argued that Pedro was likely a severely deformed infant. The baby-sized mummy seen in the 1950s X-rays were reinterpreted as undeveloped or impacted teeth, often seen in such conditions. But this theory had a massive hole. Anencephalic babies rarely survive more than a few days, and certainly not long enough to develop the bone density and old man features described by the original examiners. Furthermore, Pedro was found hundreds of miles away from any known settlement, carefully placed in a cave that was sealed from the inside or by a sophisticated method. The baby theory satisfied the skeptics, but it didn't satisfy those who held Pedro in their hands. They remembered the bronze skin, the muscular definition, and the wisdom teeth. Part 5. The Vanishing. The most frustrating part of the San Pedro Mummy story is that he is currently a ghost. In the late 1940s, the mummy was purchased by a New York businessman named Leonard Wadler. After his death, it passed to a man named Ivan Goodman. Goodman was a promoter who used Pedro to draw crowds. When Goodman died in the 1950s, the mummy was passed to a private collector whose identity has never been confirmed. Since the 1950s, nobody has seen Pedro. A $20,000 reward was offered by the Casper Star-Tribune in the early 2000s for anyone who could produce the mummy for DNA testing. The reward went unclaimed. Some say he is in a private vault in New York. Others believe he was stolen or simply decomposed after being removed from the perfect atmospheric conditions of the Wyoming cave. Part 6. Chiquita, the second mystery. Just as people began to forget Pedro, a second discovery surfaced that proved Pedro wasn't a fluke. In the late 1900s, a woman in Wyoming came forward with another mummy she had inherited. This one, named Chiquita, was also about 4 inches tall and sat in the same meditative pose as Pedro. Chiquita was taken to the Children's Hospital in Denver for X-rays and DNA testing. The results were stunning. DNA proved that Chiquita was a Native American female who lived around the year 1500. However, she suffered from the same skeletal anomalies as Pedro. The existence of a second tiny mummy in the same region suggested that there was either a recurring genetic mutation in a specific tribe, or, more tantalizingly, that the little people of the Shoshone legends were a real biological group that lived alongside our ancestors. Part 7. The Legacy of the Mountains. Today, the San Pedro Mountains remain one of the most rugged and unexplored parts of the American West. Hikers still report seeing flickers of movement in the rocks, and the legend of the Nimirigar persists in the campfires of Wyoming. The story of the San Pedro Mummy is a reminder that the New World is actually incredibly old, and that underneath the soil of the United States lie secrets that don't fit into our history books. Was Pedro an alien, a deformed child, or a member of a forgotten race of humans who were masters of the high peaks? Until the mummy resurfaces for a modern DNA test, Pedro remains the ultimate American enigma, a tiny man who cast a massive shadow over the history of the West. The mystery of Pedro does not end with his disappearance. Rather, that is where the legend truly begins to ferment in the American consciousness, turning from a local curiosity into a cornerstone of forbidden archaeology. Part 8. The Forensic Battle of 1950. While the 1930s were defined by wonder,
The 1950s were defined by cold, hard scrutiny. In 1950, Dr. Henry Shapiro and several other experts from the American Museum of Natural History sat in a room with a set of X-rays that defied the laws of biology as they knew them. The X-rays showed that the tiny creature had a skeletal structure that was almost entirely ossified, meaning the bones were those of an adult, not an infant. In a human baby, the ends of the bones are made of cartilage to allow for growth. In Pedro, these were solid bone. Even more disturbing was the presence of a full set of dentition. "He has the teeth of a meat eater," one technician reportedly remarked. The molars showed significant wear, consistent with a diet of tough, uncooked food over many years. This wasn't a child who had lived on milk for a few days. This was a being that had survived the harsh Wyoming winters for decades. How could a 14-inch man survive in the land of grizzly bears and sub-zero temperatures? The answer suggested a society, a community of little people who looked after one another, hidden in the crevices of the granite peaks. Part 9. The Smithsonian and the giant/small cover-up. In the world of American mysteries, there is a recurring villain, the Smithsonian Institution. For decades, rumors have circulated in the U.S. that the Smithsonian has a black vault where they hide artifacts that don't fit the standard timeline of human evolution, specifically skeletons of giants and tiny people. When the San Pedro Mummy was first discovered, Cecil Maine claimed he was contacted by men in suits who wanted to buy the mummy for a high price, only to bury the story. While there is no hard evidence that the Smithsonian confiscated Pedro, the legend of the disappearing artifact became a rallying cry for skeptics of mainstream science. The argument was simple. If Pedro was real, it meant that the history of North America was far more complex than a simple migration across the Bering Land Bridge. It meant that a separate, perhaps even non-human sapient branch of the human family tree had lived and died in the American West. Part 10. The Geography of the San Pedro Mountains. To understand why Pedro remained hidden for so long, one must understand the San Pedro Mountains. Located in the Carbon County region of Wyoming, this is not a place for the faint of heart. It is a labyrinth of high-altitude desert, jagged peaks, and hidden valleys that are inaccessible for 6 months of the year due to snow. The air is thin and the geology is ancient. The cave where Pedro was found was located in a geological layer that hadn't seen the sun in millions of years. This environment acted as a natural vacuum. The constant temperature and low humidity turned the body into a natural mummy, preserving the soft tissue and skin without the need for the chemicals used by ancient Egyptians. This isolation is why, even today, some hunters in Wyoming swear they have seen tiny, human-like figures watching them from the ridgelines at dusk. In the vastness of the American West, there is still plenty of room to hide. Part 11. Genetic Anomalies versus the Lost Tribe. While the University of Wyoming pointed towards anencephaly or microcephaly, others looked towards a different biological reality, insular dwarfism. This is a process where a population of animals or humans trapped in a limited environment with limited resources gradually shrinks in size over generations to survive. We see this in the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, discovered in Indonesia in 2003. Those were tiny humans, about 3 feet tall, who lived on a remote island. Could the San Pedro Mountains have acted as an island in the sky? If a group of early humans became isolated in the high Wyoming peaks during the last ice age, they might have adapted by becoming smaller. A smaller body requires less food and less water, and it can hide in smaller crevices to escape predators. Pedro might not have been a freak of nature, but a pinnacle of evolutionary survival. Part 12. The Modern Search and the $10,000 Reward. In the early 2000s, the mystery reached a fever pitch. A local researcher and businessman in Wyoming offered a $10,000 reward for the return of the mummy. He wanted to use modern DNA sequencing to finally put the baby versus adult debate to rest. Several leads emerged. One lead pointed to a high-end estate sale in New York City. Another pointed to a private museum in Florida. But every time investigators got close, the trail went cold. It is believed that the current owner likely knows the mummy is illegal to possess under NAGPRA, which requires human remains found on federal land to be returned to their respective tribes. Fear of prosecution has kept Pedro in the shadows. He is likely sitting in a shoebox in a climate-controlled basement, a silent witness to a history we are still trying to understand. Part 13. The Spirit of the American West. The story of the San Pedro Mummy is, at its heart, a uniquely American story. It is a tale of the frontier, where the line between myth and reality is as thin as the mountain air. It represents our fascination with the unknown other, the idea that we are not the first, nor perhaps the most clever to inhabit this rugged land. Pedro challenges our ego. He sits in his cross-legged pose, his sharp teeth bared in a silent grin, reminding us that for all our satellites and GPS systems, there are still places in the American wilderness where the old gods and the tiny people still hold sway. The Legacy of the Little Man. 1932. Discovery by gold prospectors. 1950. Scientific X-rays confirm adult skeletal features. 1970s. The mummy officially vanishes from public record. Today, a ghost, a legend, and a scientific what-if. The San Pedro Mummy remains the most significant out-of-place artifact in U.S. history. Whether he was a medical tragedy or a member of a lost race of humans, Pedro has achieved immortality. He has become a part of the landscape, a spirit of the Wyoming peaks that will never truly be found, because he doesn't want to be. The mystery of Pedro reaches its final, chilling chapter, not in the mountains of Wyoming, but in the sterile labs of modern science and the whispered reports of those who still claim to encounter the little people.
Part 14. The Curse of the Golden Cave. In the years following the discovery, a strange shadow seemed to follow the men who first entered that hidden grotto. Cecil Maine, one of the original prospectors, became obsessed with the mummy. He didn't just see a relic, he believed he had found a portal to a different world. He claimed that after removing Pedro, he suffered a string of bad luck, failed mines, broken health, and a lingering sense that he was being watched by something in the high country. In the American West, there was a long-standing tradition of the curse of the grave. Whether it was the Egyptian tombs or the Nimeragar caves, the message was the same. Some things are buried for a reason. Maine eventually sold his interest in the mummy, but he spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder at the San Pedro peaks. Part 15. The Poison Arrow Mystery, a Biological War. One of the most terrifying details of the Shoshone legends regarding the Nimeragar was their weaponry. They weren't just tiny people, they were masters of chemical warfare. The legends describe tiny bows carved from the horns of mountain sheep and arrows tipped with a deadly concoction made from decayed meat and the venom of rattlesnakes. In 1932, near the site where Pedro was found, researchers discovered several tiny, finely worked flint arrowheads, some less than half an inch long. To a standard human, these would be like a bee sting. But if the Nimeragar were real, and if they utilized neurotoxins, they could have brought down a full-grown elk or a man. This adds a layer of genuine danger to the mystery. Pedro wasn't just a passive observer, he belonged to a culture that was, by all accounts, incredibly fierce and strategically brilliant. Part 16. The Trail of Ivan Goodman. In the 1940s, Pedro entered the world of the American sideshow circuit. He was purchased by Ivan Goodman, a car dealer from Casper, Wyoming. Goodman was a man of his time, part businessman, part showman. He saw the mummy as the ultimate marketing tool. Goodman took Pedro to New York, where he was examined by various experts. For a while, Pedro sat in a glass case in a showroom, tiny, leathery god of the mountains surrounded by 1950s chrome and steel. But when Goodman died, the legal chain of custody shattered. The mummy was allegedly given to a friend or a private investor to settle a debt. This is where the trail turns into a labyrinth. In the 1970s and 80s, private investigators in the U.S. traced leads to a safe deposit box in a Manhattan bank, but by the time they got the warrants, the box was empty. Pedro had become a ghost artifact, moving through the underground antiquities market like a shadow. Part 19. The Chiquita Confirmation, 1994. The skeptics had a field day until 1994. That was the year Chiquita was brought to light. Found in a similar mountain crevice, this second tiny mummy was also seated in the Pedro pose. When the University of Wyoming performed DNA tests on Chiquita, the results were a massive blow to the alien theorists, but a huge win for the lost race believers. Chiquita was human. Specifically, she was a Native American infant who lived centuries ago. However, the medical examiners remained puzzled. Like Pedro, she had features that didn't align with a typical infant. Her bone density was off, and her preservation was too perfect. The discovery of a second mummy in the same geographic region confirmed that this wasn't an isolated incident. Whether it was a specific genetic lineage or a cultural practice of mummifying infants with specific deformities, the little people of Wyoming were a biological reality. Part 18. The Final Verdict: Why It Matters Today. Why does the story of a 14-inch mummy from 1932 still captivate an American audience in 2025? Because Pedro represents the great American unknown. Our history books are often written as a straight line from the Pilgrims to the present, but the San Pedro Mummy suggests a zigzag in that line. He suggests that before the fences, before the highways, and before the cities, the American wilderness was home to things we still cannot explain. If Pedro was an adult, as the 1950s X-rays and his worn-down teeth suggest, then everything we know about human biology and the history of North America needs to be revised. If he was a child with a rare defect, then he represents a heartbreaking and fascinating cultural practice of the ancient tribes. The last known stats of Pedro. Last seen, 1950s, New York, Wyoming. Current value, priceless. A $10,000 finder's fee reward still sits in a Wyoming account. Status, missing, believed to be in a private collection. Legacy, fueled the lost race theories and confirmed the accuracy of Shoshone oral traditions. Final conclusion: the Silent Mountain. Today, if you drive through the San Pedro Mountains of Wyoming, the wind still bites with the same ferocity it did in 1932. The gold is mostly gone, and the prospectors have long since turned to dust. But somewhere in those peaks, there may still be a sealed grotto. There may still be another tiny figure sitting on a stone ledge waiting for the next blast of dynamite to wake him from his 1,000-year sleep. The mystery of the San Pedro Mummy isn't about finding a body. It's about realizing that the world is much smaller and much stranger than we ever dared to imagine. Pedro remains the little man who told a big story, a story of a land that refuses to give up all its secrets. The mystery of Pedro has traveled from the dark caves of Wyoming to the sterile labs of New York, but its final chapter takes us into the very fabric of human identity and the possibility of a parallel history of the Americas. Part 19. The Little People of the Americas. The San Pedro Mummy is not an isolated incident. When researchers began looking into Pedro's origin, they realized that little people stories weren't just Shoshone folklore, they were a continental phenomenon. From the Nimaragar of Wyoming to the Yunwi-Tsunsdi of the Cherokee in North Carolina and the Ishigak of the Inuit in the Arctic, North America is blanketed in legends of a diminutive, highly intelligent, and often dangerous race. In the late 1800s, laborers in Coshocton, Ohio, discovered a pygmy graveyard containing thousands of skeletons, all between 3 and 4 feet tall, buried in stone-lined graves. In Tennessee, similar discovery reports filled local newspapers in the 1820s. To a 19th-century American, the idea of a lost race of pygmies was as common as the idea of the mound builders.
Pedro was simply the first time a flesh and bone and leathery skin example had been caught and held.
Part 22. The Hobbit Connection. Homo floresiensis. For years, skeptics used the biological impossibility argument. They claimed a 14-inch adult human couldn't exist. But in 2003, the scientific world was rocked by the discovery of Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in Indonesia. These hobbits stood about 3 feet 6 inches tall, had small brains, and lived until as recently as 12,000 years ago, overlapping with modern humans. They hunted pygmy elephants and used sophisticated stone tools. While floresiensis was taller than Pedro, the discovery proved that the standard human size is not the only way humans have existed. If nature could produce a 3-foot human in Indonesia, could a specific environmental pressure in the high-altitude, oxygen-thin San Pedro Mountains produce something even smaller? In the world of biology, island dwarfism is a proven fact. For a group of people isolated in the Wyoming peaks, the mountains were their island. Part 22. Modern Tech versus Ancient Shadows. As we move through 2025, the search for Pedro has entered a new phase. We no longer rely on dynamite and luck. Today, researchers are using LiDAR, light detection and ranging, to strip away the vegetation and topsoil of the San Pedro Mountains from the air. LiDAR can detect unnatural openings, hidden cave entrances, and structural anomalies that the human eye would miss. There are rumors of a second cave identified in 2024, located near the original 1932 blast site. While the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, keeps these coordinates strictly confidential to prevent looting, the goal is clear: to find another Pedro or Chiquita using non-invasive technology. If a third mummy is found, and if modern DNA sequencing can be performed in situ, the debate between birth defect and lost race will finally be settled. Part 23. The Secret in the DNA. If Pedro were found today, the first thing scientists would do would extract mitochondrial DNA. This would tell us 2 things. 1. The lineage. Is he closely related to the modern Shoshone or Ute people, or does he belong to a completely unknown branch of the human tree? 2. The age. Carbon-14 dating would tell us exactly when he died. Was it 500 years or 5,000? Until that DNA is found, Pedro remains a Schrodinger's mummy. He is simultaneously a medical anomaly and a legendary warrior, a baby and an old man, a myth and a reality. Part 24. The Final Horizon. The story of the San Pedro Mummy ends where it began, in the silence of the Wyoming wilderness. In the United States, we often feel like we have conquered the land. We have mapped every square inch via satellite. We have paved the plains and dammed the rivers. But Pedro serves as a reminder that the land still keeps its secrets. He represents the unknown America, the part of our history that didn't make it into the textbooks because it was too small, too strange, or too challenging to our worldview. Whether Pedro is currently sitting in a private collector's velvet-lined box or has long since crumbled into dust, his impact is permanent. He forced the Smithsonian to look closer. He gave the Shoshone legends a physical voice, and he captured the imagination of a nation. The last word on Pedro. The tiny man of the San Pedro Mountains didn't need gold to be valuable. He was the treasure. He proved that even in a world of giants, the smallest voices and the smallest bodies can leave the deepest footprints in history. If you ever find yourself in Carbon County, Wyoming, look up at the granite ridges as the sun begins to set. If you see a flicker of movement among the rocks, or if you feel a pair of eyes watching you from a crevice, don't reach for your camera. Just nod. Because in those mountains, the little people aren't a mystery, they are the neighbors. Thanks for watching.